Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, April 27th, 1982, John Hinckley went on trial for his attempted assassination of President Ronald Reagan. Just over a year earlier, on March 29th, 1981, outside a hotel in Washington, D.C., Hinckley had fired 6 bullets at Reagan. One of them hit and nearly killed the president. Another hit and paralyzed his press secretary, James Brady. 2 other people in Reagan's entourage were injured as well. Hinckley was quickly detained and arrested, and it became very clear very quickly that he had a serious mental health condition. And this trial really focused on that. The trial that started in 1982 would center on his mental health, questions of quote-unquote insanity, and lots more. So here to discuss that trial and what it means and the kind of larger moment in America where it really did feel like the country started to talk about mental health and criminalize, as we'll see, mental health in many ways. Here to discuss that, as always, are Nicole Heimer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hey, Jody.
Hey there.
And I should say that I'm particularly interested in this because I've been working on this series. This is a chance for me to plug a little bit, but I've been working on this series called Death at the Wing, hosted by this guy, Adam McKay. And one of our episodes actually sort of lives a little bit in this moment and about how mental health, conversations about mental health shifted. And a lot of it was around the Hinckley trial. And, so I've been thinking about this and we'll get into a little bit of that. But Niki, on the trial itself, what do we need to know about John Hinckley, his motivations for the assassination attempt, and then how those play into the trial?
So John Hinckley was someone who, I think that the thing that people know about him was that he shot Ronald Reagan in order to impress Jodie Foster. And the reason he did that, he became obsessed with the movie Taxi Driver. He watched it and he began to mimic it. He took on all of the characteristics of the main character, the way that he dressed, the way that he talked, the way that he, gestured. And he believed that Jodie Foster, who played one of the characters in the movie, that he could obtain her or win her if he could just get into her field of vision. He followed her to Yale University. He was stalking her, and he finally decided that the way that he was going to get her attention was to assassinate the president.
Yeah. And so, as they start to investigate Hinckley, they realize he'd written all these letters. He was effectively a stalker in many ways for Foster. That is disturbing behavior on its own. I do want to take a moment to just point out also just Jodie Foster is 12 years old when she's in Taxi Driver. That is incredibly problematic on its own. And I think there's lots of conversations about the sort of sexualization of young women in that era and in movies, and it continues to today. But, so Jodie Foster, in addition to all of this, is also just incredibly young and, a kid. And by the time this rolls around, she's a student at Yale University, as we've been saying, and she has Hinckley's obsession with her. There is no real direct connection between this assassination attempt and Foster. I mean, Hinckley really just wakes up and says, I'm going to get Jodie Foster's attention by doing this thing, right?
Yeah, and he does something pretty nefarious in that when he is planning out his plot to assassinate Ronald Reagan, he, writes up this letter to Jodie Foster. And in this letter, he almost tries to not implicate her, but connect her in some ways to this so that in the aftermath, they would have to sort of question Jodie Foster about her involvement. But the letter that he dubs is pretty disturbing. Should I read part of the letter? He says, right before he's about to commit this violent act, he says, quote, "I will admit to you that the reason I'm going ahead with this attempt now is because I just cannot wait any longer to impress you. I've got to do something now to make you understand in no uncertain terms that I'm doing this for your sake. By sacrificing my freedom and possibly my life, I hope to change your mind about me." And this is even more disturbing because, Jodie Foster is completely unaware of who this person is, of why he would pen this letter to her before, why he would even connect her to Ronald Reagan in this way, or that this act would somehow symbolize their or connect their relationship. A lot of this just does not make any sense. It doesn't add up. And I think that's part of the confusion about what takes place after he is apprehended, after the shooting, I should say.
Right. People want tidy narratives especially about something like this, because we could talk about this, but President Reagan nearly died in this assassination attempt. And so people want to understand why that happened, but they're trying to map a narrative on to someone who is not thinking in clear, logical ways, right? It's not about Jodie Foster. It's about this obsession and this kind of obsessive thought loop that he's caught in. So people say that he shot Reagan in order to impress Jodie Foster. I mean, yes, sort of. But he shot Reagan because he was dealing with mental illness.
Yeah. And, there's this interesting phenomenon, though, where he, as you just read from that letter, he's doing this act to kind of center Foster and get her attention and bring her into and connect the two. Mm-hmm. That is, in a sense, what ends up happening, because the trial, as we really does end up being so much about his obsession with Foster, and she has to testify during the trial. And so in this really sort of weird, awful, twisted way, like, it does connect them, you know?
Yeah, but it's again, disturbing. I can't overuse this word, because he basically says that, like, he's not going to cooperate unless they bring Jodie Foster in to testify. And so they create these parameters around bringing her in to give a testimony. They make it so that it's just the judge and the lawyers. But, Hinckley is so thrilled that, he tells his parents, "I can't believe I'm going to be in the same room with her or in the same space as her." And, she shows up to answer questions, which I imagine is probably not a lot of questions to answer. She doesn't look at him. She doesn't make eye contact. She doesn't sort of connect with him in any way. And this infuriates him because it was clear that he had used this attempt in order to make a connection with her, and that just doesn't happen.
Yeah. But just imagine, right? I mean, having to give that testimony, be in the same room with this person. I mean, I don't know what the way to phrase it, but it kind of feels like he got what he wanted in some really twisted way,
I mean, their names are forever linked. People talk about John Hinckley and they talk about Jodie Foster in the same sentence all the time.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know the deep details of this trial. I don't know how the legal proceedings would have taken shape. He, was insisting that he would not cooperate unless she testified. But, at some level, the decision on the part of the legal teams to bring her in and testify just feels crazy. It's sort of jaw-dropping, and it does feel like something of a moment when no one was really you can imagine the moment when no one was thinking about what Jodie Foster would have to go through in order to do this, right? It was all through the lens of this trial needs to go forward, and then, we just have to bring her in and testify. Similarly, at the end of this trial, they all watch Taxi Driver. I mean, this is another one of those details that just makes your head spin a little bit, but they sit there and they watch the entire movie, and you're like, what exactly does that contribute?
What does the showing of this film have
in its
to
entirety.
do? In its entirety, not a clip, in its entirety. what does that have to do with the assassination attempt of Ronald Reagan, with the fact that, one of his men is paralyzed, with the fact that people have real traumatic scars? To me, the fact that a lawyer would say, this is a great way to close this argument, we're going to show the entire film, as a way to explain behavior that's inexplicable. Yeah. It just never made sense to me, the sort of theater that's happening in this moment.
Well, it gives you a sense of the trickiness or the amateurness around discussing mental illness in this moment, because here they're sort of exploring all of the crevices of the delusion, when that's not what's important here, right? It's not important to talk to Jodie Foster. It's not important to see the movie. It might be pretty important to talk to some psychiatrists and let them help explain what's going on. But it's a really odd trial.
Yeah,
I will say it's even more difficult in the sense that a lot of these leading scientists, psychologists can't find consensus around his mental health. So they can't properly diagnose, but what is this? Is he perfectly normal and he's just a narcissist? Is he, is he having a breakdown? Is he schizophrenic? Is he all of, that was never made clear either, what was actually ailing him. And so I think the inability to find consensus about that makes this trial difficult to make a judgment that would be fair.
Yeah. And no surprise, all of the government psychiatrists who visited with him declared him mentally sane and mentally fit, and all of the defense psychiatrists said and that was, to be clear, that was their defense, was that he was insane, and so we should advance the story and point out that in the end, the jury of 12 did return a not guilty verdict on insanity grounds, and this was a massive, high-profile moment where the insanity defense was used to successful ends, and it created this enormous conversation around specifically the insanity defense. And at the time, 83% of Americans who were polled thought justice was not done. And it created, as I said, this huge conversation about the insanity defense broke out, despite the fact that it was very rarely used. I mean, only 2% of felony cases used an insanity defense at the time. 75% of that time it failed, but it was this flashpoint moment where the whole country, or much of the country felt like, oh my gosh, criminals are getting off on this flimsy excuse of insanity.
It really does fit in with a broader arc or narrative that's happening at the time. This idea that the criminal justice system is too soft on people who commit crimes. And so you get this almost backlash against the insanity defense after the Hinckley trial. And looking at it now from the perspective of a country that I think has moved in a different direction when it comes to criminal justice reform, it essentially
and mental health.
Yeah. And it takes away a tool for being able to assess whether a person did something willfully, if somebody did something, that they had reasoned out. It really was of a piece with the politics of the time as well.
But even sort of, the makeup of the jury, the fact that of the 12 people, 11 of them are black and, one is white, even that got politicized as a way of saying, well, black people hate Reagan, so they did this on purpose. They did this as a way to sort of let his would-be killer go. All of that, I think, gets colored by the makeup of the jury, too.
Yeah. And, this is a little bit of what in this series that I was talking about, we try and track is the shift from the 70s into the 80s, a sort of real reactionary push on all fronts during the Reagan era, including on mental health. So, certainly in the late 70s, I mean, Jimmy Carter, and especially his wife, Rosalind Carter, they tried to make some real efforts towards mental health in this country, and Reagan sort of snaps that back. And this story is part of that as well. So a couple years after this trial in 1982, Congress passes, and this is just such an Orwellian name, but the Insanity Defense Reform Act of 1984. And that makes the bar much higher to prove quote unquote severe mental disease in criminal trials. And it also fits into, as you were saying, Niki, this larger sort of criminalization of behavior, that is seen as outside the norm. And so much so that, and there's a lot of really great writing and research on this, but, the criminalization of mental health in this era is just stunning. And actually, it ends up being that if you look at the top psychiatric facilities in America at the time by population, they're all in prisons, right? The biggest populations of people who are receiving psychiatric treatment are jailed. And that's where you really start to see this shift.
I mean, so much. How do you untether criminality from mental health? Like that, the fact that they're housed in the same location to me is so telling about what we think about people who struggle with mental health and how we think they should be cared for, and what location we think they should be cared for, too. So, I mean, it's interesting when the aftermath of this is all over, because Hinckley was found not guilty because reason of insanity. He was housed in a hospital, in a mental hospital, until about July of 2016, when Judge Paul Friedman concluded that Hinckley is no longer posing, a threat to himself or to others, and he grants him release, but the release is limited with certain conditions. So, he has to live within the limits of his residence. He can't really travel far outside of Southern Virginia. He's also forbidden to come in contact with past or present presidents or their relatives or their homes or their grave sites, which I thought was interesting. And he's banned from contacting Jodie Foster and other entertainers. And he can also no longer watch violent movies, television, or violent, TV, or online digital materials, since apparently that had such an influence on him. The confinement in 2018, the restriction that confined him to his mother's house, ends.
So I think that restriction on content is really interesting. And in some other episode, we should probably talk about
another moral panic, right?
Another moral panic. Another, this idea that the movie made him do it is also, it's of a piece with the period in which there's all of this hand-wringing over rap lyrics and movie and television content.
Yeah, and you can see that it's still lingering in the judge's defense even in 2016. Though I will say, as we wrap up, like, we have gotten better at this stuff, and I think that you look at this era in the 80s, and it's similar to, I think, a lot of the 50s and 60s. I mean, I think the 70s was just this small little blip of maybe a little bit of enlightenment around these issues, and then it snapped back in the 80s. But this idea that it's a binary, right? It's either like, oh, you're having some mental problems, but like grit your teeth and bear it, and we won't talk about it, or you're certifiable and you should be confined either in jail or in an institution. Life, There's no space in between. And we're finally starting to have a conversation spurred, on a lot of different fronts, but about all of the huge gray area and spectrum in the middle. And so, I think this is one of those places, like in my lifetime and certainly in recent years, where it feels like we actually have started to progress a little bit. Okay, well, I think we should leave it there. And one more plug for Death at the Wing, which deals with, there's an episode on mental health, but it deals with a lot of other issues and sort of how the United States changed in the 1980s through the lens of NBA basketball. I promise we pull it off. I think it's very compelling. So go take a listen. Even if you don't like sports, if you like politics, which I think you do, if you're listening to this podcast, you should go check it out. But anyway, Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. I do this from time to time, but it is worth pointing out that our show relies in large part on listener support. So if you want to become a supporter of this show and the work that we do at Radiotopia in general, you can go on our website, thisdaypod.com, and find a way to support. One-time donation, monthly donation. We really do appreciate it. Another great way to help is to just spread the word about the show. If you are enjoying this show, please go to social media or just tell someone or just email some folks or maybe, hire a skywriter or something and just spread the word about the show. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
I felt very shocked, very frightened, and very distressed. The first time I knew that the FBI was involved was when somebody called me up and said, please come over and talk to the FBI. That was also at the same moment, I think maybe 10 minutes later, when I heard about the whole Reagan deal. I didn't know anything about it until that point.
Radiotopia.